Chapter 9. Friendship Skullduggery. Brox and Thistlethorn traveled through a series of corridors, occasionally turning to the left or right. They made their way up and down short flights of stairs and passageways that sloped gently and occasionally bent backwards. Eventually, they came to an oversized door standing 14 feet tall and being a generous 6 feet wide. It had been built with several thick wooden planks and bound together with iron bolts and fasteners. A simple lift latch could be seen about halfway up the door. The shortling was too short to reach the lift latch, therefore Brox had to push it up to get it to release. However, when he pushed on the door, it did not budge. "The latch is clearly in the up position," noted Brox. "Do you think that someone has placed something heavy on the other side to keep it from opening? Or could it be spiked shut?" Thistlethorn pushed on the door. "It doesn't rattle." He pushed, again. "It doesn't even move slightly." He looked at Brox. If it had been barricaded or spiked shut, it would have moved a little, unless it had been very, very well barricaded or spiked shut, which is unlikely. It would be my guess that it has swollen shut from years of humidity and has wedged itself extra tight from a lack of use. "How do we open it?" "Brute force." "I don't think that we are strong enough." "True." Thistlethorn's voice sounded even as he slowly pulled out a short crowbar. "Where did you get that?" asked Brox. His eyes were wide from the idea that the other even could conceal such a tool under his leather armor. "People of my class carry such useful gear." The shortling twirled the crowbar in his hand twice. "Now, a lot of force at a little area time after time works." Wedging the crowbar in the crack between the door and the door frame, Thistlethorn placed one foot on the door and pulled. He did this repeatedly, sometimes pulling, sometimes pushing, and sometimes having Brox help. The door creaked and cracked with each solid pull. Thistlethorn did not approve of the noise, realizing that anyone on the other side of the door would hear them, but there was no other option. Brox did not even know a silent spell that he could cast on the door to stop the sound. As Thistlethorn reached the top of the door, he had to stand precariously on the edge of a splintered barrel that they had found in the corridor. Finally, the shortling finished, and the door gave a low slow thunk sound as it popped open, pivoting unhurriedly on its hinges. Thistlethorn handed Brox the short crowbar and drew the magic sword. Brox started to step forward when the shortling held up a hand, signaling for the other to not move. Brox froze, peering down the corridor, looking for a stalking monster such as an orc or a troll. Yet, he saw nothing. He saw a corridor of grey polished stones. He tried to glance down another corridor that split off to the right about 20 feet up ahead. Nothing hinted at danger. "The corridor looks clear." Brox spoke in a hushed tone. "Yes, you're right." Thistlethorn lowered the elven blade. "I just thought that I heard the sound of something snapping closed. Perhaps it was an echo." Thistlethorn nodded his head. Changing the subject, he asked, "Which way did the Myris tell us to go?" "Go straight. The corridor to the right leads to a weapons training room." Thistlethorn started to walk. He looked back at Brox. "Simply make sure that you stay at least a few steps behind me so that—" He never finished his statement. Part of the floor gave way, and he fell into a pit that led to a chute. Brox reached out to grab his friend, but it was too late. Thistlethorn was already sliding down the chute, and the pit door was already closing in preparation of its next victim. Brox rammed Thistlethorn's small crowbar into the pit's trapdoor, forcing it open, giving him a chance to see below. The pit went down about 5 feet before angling away into a slippery waxed chute. Between the angle and the length of the chute, Brox could not see where it terminated. "Thistlethorn!" Brox yelled his friend's name several times over the minutes, but he never received an answer. It suddenly occurred to him that if any wandering monsters were around, they would come and investigate. Therefore, he was not surprised when he heard movement coming from the corridor that split off to the right. Brox stood quietly, not even daring to breathe. The sound coming from the side corridor sounded like a cross between water running down a gutter during a light rain with a sowish and mud splattering on the ground with a thud. Brox could tell that whoever was moving down the side corridor had stopped just shy of the junction. Brox yanked the crowbar out of the pit's trapdoor, raised it, and then stepped away from the junction, putting the trapdoor of the pit between him and whoever, or whatever, was coming. He waited and waited. The sound changed. Now, he could hear a sound similar to mice being run over by wagon wheels. It was a gross, sloppy, wet sound, a sound that gave Brox a sick feeling in his stomach. Then something very unusual happened. The unwholesome sound stopped. It was replaced by whistling, a ballad that Brox knew, no drums, no trumpets. Moreover, Brox realized that it was Thistlethorn whistling. Thistlethorn? Brox whispered in a low voice. Yes, came the reply. As if on cue, Thistlethorn stepped around the corner. Who else would it be? Thistlethorn's voice proved cold and hard, almost angry. Were you expecting a hungry ogre? I guess not. Brox seemed a bit unsure of how to answer Thistlethorn's negative tone of voice. What happened to you? What happened to me? What happened to me? The shortling sounded bitter. This was a sure sign that he was unhappy about what had just happened. I fell into the pit and down a slide. Then, I landed on the hard floor where I lay on the cold ground, waiting for you to come help me. Did you come? Of course not. I had to find my own way out. I had to go upstairs on a twisting stairwell, bashing against the wall because I couldn't see. He pointed to the burning torch in Brox's hand. You have the torch, and I do not. Moreover, I don't know what happened to the magic sword. He pointed back to the junction. Finally, I stood there and waited for you, but you didn't come. You were making a strange sound. I thought that you were a monster. Thistlethorn shot him an angry look. Brox looked at Thistlethorn. Don't worry about it, said the shortling. I'm fine. Brox noted that the other's tone of voice sounded a bit more neutral. He must have been self-conscious that he, being a roguish shortling, fell for the oldest trick in the book, a pit. Brox tried to have a well-that's-over tone as he spoke. You just disappeared down the chute. I figured that it led into a prison cell or worse, like a pool of acid or the lair of hungry manticores. Humph. Thistlethorn's voice was gruff. No worthless trap is going to get me. It's going to take a pair of dragons or a 50-ton landslide to bring me down. Of course. Brox looked at his friend. He was not used to the other boasting. In fact, shortlings rarely boasted, unless they were laughing and guffawing in outrageous humor. Still, he seemed miffed. Well, let's eat. Thistlethorn's tone sounded snappy. That trip down the chute and back up here has made me hungry. Thistlethorn went about pulling out some foodstuffs consisting of an apple, honey, and a sealed canister of brickle tea. I didn't know that you liked brickle tea, noted a perplexed Brox. Thistlethorn looked as though he himself had made some kind of mistake. Then, with a quick recovery, he said, You're right. I don't, but that's why I brought the honey. He scoffed. A lot of honey will get rid of the tea's bitter taste. Without waiting for Brox to bring up some new objection, he poured the brickle tea and dumped a little honey into his tea and a lot of honey into Brox's. Pulling a dagger out of his boot, he cut the apple in half, giving Brox one piece and keeping the other piece for himself. He held up his brickle tea and made a toast to overcoming the difficulties of the Cross underworld. Brox raised his brickle tea up. Agreed. Thistlethorn placed his brickle tea down and started to eat the apple half. Brox was surprised that the other did not take a swig after the proposed toast. Thistlethorn seemed to have noticed this. Oh, yes. The shortling's voice rasped. Like you said, I don't like brickle tea. I figured that I would eat this delicious apple before I ruin the taste with a drink of this bitter stuff. Why don't you just add some more honey? Thistlethorn seemed like he wished to hide a perturbed look. Don't worry about me, just drink up. Brox nodded his head, slipped his hand into his jacket pocket, and held up his brickle tea. You're right. Thistlethorn stopped eating the apple and stared expectantly at the gnome. Brox took a hearty drink, finishing half of the brickle tea at once. That's not too bad for being brickle tea. It does, however, taste a bit odd, like it has grounded ginger in it. I would guess that is mostly due to the honey. Thistlethorn smiled. His smile soon turned into fits of laughter. What's so funny? Asked a confused Brox. Thistlethorn laughed a moment longer before regaining self-control. That. He started, fighting back another harsh round of laughter. That was more than brickle tea and honey. Really? Very much so. Thistlethorn smirked darkly. Very much so. You are acting awfully odd. Perhaps. Perhaps not. Thistlethorn's face became cold, rigid, calculating, and detestable. Brox stared into a look of malice that could not only be seen but felt from the core. The gnome replied with his own hard look. You're not really Thistlethorn, are you? Not at all. He pointed at the gnome. I see that you are finally showing some intelligence. But it's too late. Yes, far too late. What do you mean? The impostor nodded his head in deep satisfaction. As I said, that was more than brickle tea and honey. It was a rich dose of poison. Brox leaned backwards. But I have been trained in the skills of plant magic. Therefore, poisons made from plant extracts have little effect on me. You do realize that virtually all poisons are made from plant extracts. That includes those made by an alchemist. Yes. I knew that would be a problem. The Shaden Morg told me as much. Brox raised an eyebrow at this statement. The impostor continued. Therefore, a little skullduggery was needed. You were given the most sly of all poisons, friend venom. The poison is magical, you know. It is not a plant extract, bypassing your druidic defenses. The stronger the friendship, the stronger the poison. You and Thistlethorn are great friends. But you are not Thistlethorn. But you perceived me as Thistlethorn. That is why the poison will still work. Your skills of plant magic will be of no help. The impostor picked up his brickle tea and drank it. In fact, it has no effect upon me. He smiled coldly. That is because you now realize that I am not Thistlethorn, and that I am not your friend, but your enemy. I can now share the friend venom with you and be perfectly safe. The impostor smiled with a look of triumph. In a moment, you will simply fall over dead. That may be so. Brox drank the rest of the brickle tea, tipping the cup twice to get a few more drops. But I also know that before I drank the friendship venom, I put on this ring of indifferent contrariness. He pulled his hand out of his jacket pocket and showed it to the impostor. This ring is designed to nullify charm spells. One of its side effects is it reverses friend venom. He pointed at the impostor's empty flagon. Provided that you have a drink, too. The impostor's eyes went wide. Immediately, he jumped up to attack Brox, going for the dagger he had used to cut the apple. Before he could pick the blade up, he fell to the ground and died. That was a fast death, said Brox. He shrugged. Good poison. The image that once served as Thistlethorn changed into a grey-skinned creature. It looked formless and indistinct. Brox could tell it was a type of doppelganger, but which kind, he could not tell. Was it a slider? Polly? Two-Face? Or just a regular doppelganger? When he looked closer, he saw a few thin streaks of yellow around the flaps that served as ears. A polydoppelganger. Most doppelgangers killed their prey outright. Polydoppelgangers kept their prey alive for a little while so that they could feed off the victim's thoughts over a period of about a week. That would imply that Thistlethorn still lived. Brox picked up his stuff and wandered off, looking for his friend. Brox had determined that if he backtracked the way that the polydoppelganger had come, he would find Thistlethorn. He walked down to the junction and made his way down the side corridor. He paused for a moment to look at a grey, sick, revolting, gooey substance that oozed near the junction. He recognized it as the place where the polydoppelganger had transformed itself into a duplicate of Thistlethorn. After leaving the pasty grey stuff, Brox quickly arrived at the weapons training room. He read a big sign by the entrance to this room. "Place torch here." Brox noted several slots for holding torches. He placed the torch in one of the lower slots. The weapons training room did not have a door but a gate made of only 4 bars. It had been constructed in such a fashion as to allow a spectator to watch those training inside the room, keeping the spectator outside of the room in relative safety. Instead of opening the gate to enter, Brox just slipped through 2 of the widespread bars. As soon as he did this, 2 lanterns hanging from the ceiling began to produce a mild light, giving the room a yellow glow. The room certainly looked like a weapons training room. At one end of the room, there stood a rack full of wooden swords, wooden halberds, wooden maces, and other wooden weapons, including a dwarven skull rake, which was a 2-handed weapon with a massive warhammer at one end, the skull, and a double-bladed axe at the other, the rake. On the other side of the room were stacked several sets of cloth armor, thick pieces of canvas with leather straps and tarnished brass buckles. On the right-hand wall, from floor to ceiling, were haphazardly arranged wooden shields of every size, from small bucklers and targets to medium shields and all the way up to large shields, kite shields, and tower shields. Brox could see a trapdoor in the floor that, theoretically, led to where Thistlethorn was held prisoner. However, next to the trapdoor stood a small, crudely fashioned, wooden table that looked like it had been patchworked together, wooden shields for the tabletop and weapons, such as wooden sword blades and javelin shafts, 4 table legs. Behind the table, sitting on a stool, Brox saw a training dummy, the kind that is typically tied to a pole so a warrior can practice various strategic strikes. The training dummy looked like, as much as possible, a scarecrow but made out of bundles of sticks twined together with cloth bands and leather cords each drawn tight to keep everything together. For a head, someone had used a block of wood that was loosely rounded off into an oval shape. A pair of solid green eyes had been painted on it to give it some semblance of a face. There was one other thing about this tangle of wooden sticks: it was animated, its head resting on its stick hands, eyes looking dully at Brox. The gnome entered the room, showing caution by keeping the sledgehammer in his hands. The little man jumped slightly when the animated stick stood up. Brox thought that the other might grab a wooden sword and engage him in a round of fencing or the like. Instead, it grabbed a stool and placed it on the other side of the table, made a motion for Brox to be seated, and then walked over to its side of the table and sat down. Now, the gnome could see a necklace hanging from the other's neck containing a medallion shaped like a pair of crossed swords. Brox's magical training allowed him to sense that this medallion was enchanted and gave the stickman the ability to be animated. "Greetings," said Brox, trying to sound cordial. The other pointed to the side of its head, indicating that it had no ears and could not hear. Then, it pointed to some parchment, a vial of ink, and a quill, indicating that it could write. Brox accepted this and sat down across from this strange, animated stickman. Holding the quill between 2 twigs that served as fingers, the stickman dipped the quill twice into the vial of ink and scribbled a few letters on the parchment. The writing was scratchy and broken, but the message was very clear. The stickman had written its name. Sticker. The stickman scratched out a few more words. "Why are you here?" it asked. Sticker handed Brox the quill. Brox wrote, "I am seeking a friend." Brox handed the quill back to Sticker. "Down the trapdoor," replied the stickman. "Yes." Sticker wrote something, crossed it out, and then wrote, "You may enter if you can riddle me." Brox just stared at the unflinching green eyes of Sticker. It wanted to engage in a battle of riddles. This was highly irregular. What kind of animated stick creature would engage in riddles? After a few moments, Brox nodded his head in acceptance. Then he decided to ask what the stakes were. Sticker wrote, "If you win, I'll open the trapdoor into that foul mimic's lair. If you lose, I tie you to that pole and spend a day training, using you as my practice target." Brox just looked at Sticker. He thought of what would happen if he lost. It would be just fine if the stickman were tied to the pole and battered around, but Brox figured that he would be bludgeoned to death if he were used for target practice. He considered reaching over and snatching the medallion off the stick man, which would effectively cause this tangle of sticks to cease to be animated. Yet, some obscure warning bell ringing in the back of his mind told him that Sticker would have exceptionally quick reflexes since it had been constructed to train for combat. In short, the gnome knew that he would pay a heavy price if he attempted any such action, and that was a price that he was unwilling to chance. If he had not been in such a hard position, he would have flat ignored the challenge. Yet, his friend needed him, therefore he had to do what he had to do. He jotted 2 words on the parchment. "I accept." Sticker pulled out a well-worn scroll made of yellowed parchment and anchored it with 2 cracked wooden pins. The stickman unrolled it slowly, being sure not to damage the fragile scroll. Across the top were written the words, "Rules of the Riddles." Underneath were the 15 rules. 1. No bogus riddles. 2. No idle staring into space while thinking of an answer. 3. You may close your eyes while thinking of an answer, but you may not grimace while doing so. 4. No laughing or taunting while the other thinks. 5. No walking around to think of an answer. 6. The person being riddled may ask for a clarification on a riddle as long as the clarification does not answer the riddle or supply an obvious clue to solving the riddle. 7. No sneering. 8. No fighting. 9. No caterwauling. 10. No tapping on the table while waiting for an answer. The individual who must answer the riddle may tap if it so chooses. 11. The individual giving the riddle may not stare down or intimidate the other. 12. The individual who gives the riddle may rap 3 times on the table if the other is taking too long to answer, not a tap but a rap. If the individual does this rapping twice, the riddle is considered unanswered. 13. The individual who is answering the riddle may shrug, indicating it does not know the answer. This is a forfeit. 14. The individual who asked the riddle must supply the answer at the end upon demand. 15. No open flames. Brox noticed that this last rule was in the handwriting of the stick man. Brox read the rule slowly a second time, making sure that he understood. The stickman nodded, took the quill from Brox, dipped it in the flask, and proceeded to write the first riddle. A leather-coiled snake, the sound of thunder is in my wake. I am brown or black as night. I have no venom but possess a weltering bite. Sticker slid the parchment across the table for Brox to examine. Brox read it twice and then sat back to ponder the question. His first thought was a rope, because ropes look like snakes and are brown. However, they were seldom made out of leather or caused welts, maybe a rope burn, but the riddle said nothing about burns. He went over things coiled up, string, yarn, thread, springs. They did not help. He considered everything that caused welts, dog bites, being slapped, being hit with a leather belt. He had it. Taking the quill, he wrote down his answer. A whip. The stickman nodded its head, acknowledging the correct answer. Brox considered his riddle. At first, he was going to use this riddle. You feel it bumping as the days go by, but if you see it, you will die. The answer to that riddle was your heart. Brox decided not to use it because the stickman had no heart, and his riddle could be disqualified for that reason as being bogus. He tried one he had heard as a child. I am used in defenses from an enemy raid. People seek me out when houses are made. Shave me thin and upon me books can be read. I am put around you when you are dead. Brox thought he had produced a great riddle, but the stickman answered immediately. Wood. When Sticker wrote the answer so quickly, it occurred to Brox that a riddle dealing with wood in any fashion would be easily answered by a creature made out of sticks. After this, the two of them rapidly exchanged riddles. One would write down a riddle and pass it over to the other. In turn, a quick response was made by the other, writing the answer down. Sticker wrote next. For it to have any worth, you must give it. For it to have any worth, you must keep it. Brox smiled and wrote, your word. Brox wrote his riddle. Every time I move, I go in circles, but straight ahead in my path. You will either use me or a heavy walking staff. Sticker picked up the heavy parchment, read the riddle, and wrote an answer. Wheel. Sticker wrote a riddle. I bend to the ground, crying without sound. I drink when water seeps. My kind always weeps. Brox, knowing druidic magic, knew the answer before finishing the second line. Weeping willow. The gnome put forth a riddle of a creature that he often sees in his garden at night. I hover in the air with a brilliant flare. I use my voice to sing when I dance around a fairy ring. Sticker did not even dip the quill before answering. Pixie. The stickman wrote a riddle about a magic item. I am dark and round and cannot be bound. Put anything into me like a cup, nothing will ever fill me up. Brox read the riddle twice. Although he had never seen one of these, he knew what it was. Orb of obliteration. He rubbed his eyes twice and wrote his riddle. I have no personal powers, but I guard great towers. I am yours to command when I am in your hand. The stickman looked at the sticks that made up its hand and then gave an answer. A key. Sticker thought a moment before scripting a riddle. Without a sound or fight, day becomes night. It may not seem right, but a moment later it's bright. Just as Brox's first riddle had been too easy for an individual made out of sticks, Sticker's riddle was just as easy for an expert in astronomy. An eclipse. Brox could not interpret the stickman's wooden facial expressions. However, he had the sensation that the other was perplexed with the fact that the riddle was answered speedily. Perhaps it was one of Sticker's harder riddles. Brox wrote a riddle he had heard his great-grandfather put forth in a riddling challenge well over 100 years earlier. It was the same riddle that his great-grandfather had used to win his first riddling contest in Rustic Haven. Although sometimes I can give a fright, I can never do so in the blackness of night. At noon, I am smaller. The rest of the day I am taller. The stickman read the riddle once and then leaned forward and read it again, this time running a wooden finger under each word in the process. The big green painted eyes widened on its wooden face as it turned over the riddle, dissecting each phrase one at a time. As to what it was thinking, Brox could not tell, but he could tell that it was deep in contemplation. Not once, not twice, but thrice, it interlaced its wooden fingers and cracked them the same way Brox would before he would play the oversized old-fashioned pipe organ in his burrow. Each time Sticker did that it sounded like logs being split by an axe in a quick series of snaps. Brox quietly watched as the other turned its head to the right and then to the left. Placing both of its elbows on the table, burying its head in its hands, sitting there for a very long time. Brox had no idea what he was supposed to do until he glanced at the rules. Therefore, he rapped 3 times. On the table. Sticker looked up at the gnome, twisting slightly, making a cracking sound of burning firewood. Brox knew that the other did not know the answer, and he wondered if the other would attack him in response. Would the animated sticks grab a wooden practice sword and strike? Would this magical construct simply flip over the table and pummel the smaller gnome to the ground, overbear him, and pull his arms out of socket? Brox was prepared to run away when the stickman made its move. However, it did not grab a weapon or charge Brox. Sticker shrugged. After the stickman shrugged, it pushed the parchment over to Brox, indicating that it wanted the gnome to write down the answer by tapping a stick finger underneath the riddle. Your shadow. The animated sticks calmly read the answer and nodded acceptance. Then, without ceremony or flash or elaboration, Sticker stood up, moved over to the trapdoor, and opened it, revealing a series of rusty iron rungs fastened to the wall, leading down about 10 feet. Brox had expected that he would have to go down by himself, but the stickman went down first, making a clang as each of its wooden feet stepped on a hollow rung. Void of light below, save that which filtered down from the weapons training room, Brox had trouble seeing. He was inclined to light a torch or even a candle, but then he remembered the stickman's handwritten rule about no open flames. Even though they were no longer riddling, he figured that the animated sticks had a strong fear of fire and might attack anyone possessing it. As he climbed down, straining his eyes in the thin streams of light, he wondered if the stickman had some form of ultravision or infravision. Brox saw the shadowy outline of Sticker as it walked over to some type of door or portcullis. Brox could not tell in the darkness. He heard a whir, click, crack, 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 and clank. Then, he heard another voice shouting a warning. "I don't know who you are or what you are, but if you come one step closer, I'll run you through." It was the unmistakable voice of Thistlethorn. As soon as he finished speaking, a faint blue light came out of the doorway. "Prepare for battle, you bag of sticks." Brox thought it was a good thing that Sticker was deaf, or else the stickman might have reacted to Thistlethorn's challenge. After all, the creature was an animated practice dummy. Thistlethorn. Brox was only about halfway down the rung ladder. He was not sure if his voice had carried into the prison cell with the shortling. He called out again. "Thistlethorn. Brox? Don't attack the stickman." The shortling started to challenge Brox's assumed safety of the animated sticks when Sticker turned and walked away, appearing to be disinterested in the dialogue between the gnome and the shortling. With his guard still up, Thistlethorn exited the room, the magic sword in one hand and his backpack in the other. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. All three of them were back in the weapons training room. A few moments later, Thistlethorn and Sticker were engaged in mock combat, the stickman showing the other how to use the elven blade to its potential. Brox sat at the table, fixing a jagged rip that Thistlethorn's backpack had gotten when he had slid down the chute. After tightening a couple of leather strings along the side of the backpack, Brox watched Thistlethorn work on a backbend, duck-end strike, attack maneuver. This he did over a dozen times, with Sticker walking him through every step in precise moves, slow at first and then at faster and faster speeds as Thistlethorn showed increasing skill. After drilling over this several times, they practiced other moves of Sticker's devising. After Thistlethorn went through his rigorous routine, he and Brox had a bite to eat and drink, consisting of maple sugar-coated almonds, grape jelly thickly spread on slices of wheat bread, and a generous portion of berry budge. When they finished their meal, they said their goodbyes, or, more specifically, wrote their goodbyes, and made their way to the room with the mirror of two walls. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The Cross-Down world had a great many tricks and traps. The riddling encounter with Sticker had been a trick. The down-the-chute and encounter with the Polydoppelganger had been a trap. Yet, both of these, a trick and a trap, had been encounters with sentient beings that had their own will and motivation. However, most of the tricks and traps in the Cross-Down world did not involve sentient beings, and it was this type that both Brox and Thistlethorn were now repeatedly encountering. The first trap that they encountered was a series of murder holes, that is to say, holes in the ceiling where razor-sharp objects are dropped or through which dangerous substances are poured. This particular set of murder holes contained very small holes into which boiling hot oil could be poured. Thistlethorn simply avoided this trap by noting the shiny floor where oil had previously been poured, the runoff draining vats, and the tiny holes in the ceiling. In order to bypass the trap, he threw a heavy rock onto one of the many pressure plates in the floor. When he did that, a barrel of boiling hot oil poured through the holes in the ceiling along 25 feet of corridor. When he heard the soft click of the reset mechanism, indicating that the trap would be disabled a few moments while the barrel refilled, he and Brox ran at half speed, being too slippery to run at full speed, to the other end before the barrel of oil could dump its contents, again. Their next encounter proved to be a complex but deadly trick. They had been walking down corridors and through rooms that had burning torches along the walls and hanging lanterns from the ceiling. They greatly appreciated all of this excessive light. Little did they know that it was an elaborate scheme to desensitize them to one final room that had this type of light source carefully placed to distract the unwary. Thistlethorn continued to lead the way, looking intently for tripwires, pressure plates, pits, murder holes, and other hazards. He would find them on occasion and dodge them with ease. The only major trap he had seen was a statue of a bugbear holding a great axe. If an individual touched the statue, the bugbear's arm would pivot down, and the great axe would hit the individual. This was a classic trap, and, hence, obvious trap, and they passed on by it. Just past the bugbear statue stood a plain ordinary wooden door. It was not extra thick or bound in iron bands or leather straps. It was just the typical dungeon door, one of nearly 50 that they had seen. Thistlethorn opened the door and could see an empty room with a door on the other side, 4 torches in the walls, 2 on the left and 2 on the right, and a bullseye lantern hanging from the ceiling. Its beam of light shined straight on Thistlethorn, impairing his vision. As soon as he stepped into the room, he discovered the trick through the School of Hard Knocks. Due to his impaired vision, he could not tell that the entire room had no floor. To make matters more difficult, the bottom half of the room, that is to say, the part below the missing floor, had been painted to look like there was still a floor, a true work of art to produce the illusion of a solid floor. Thistlethorn had become accustomed to the well-lit rooms and felt no foreboding when he encountered another well-lit room with the bullseye lantern. He had been half blinded by the light from the bullseye lantern and unable to see that there was no floor. The only good thing that Thistlethorn had going for him was the nimble as a cat, fast as a fox, graceful as a Pegasus, high dexterity of a shortling. When he fell, he spun around and caught the edge of the floor just in time to keep from landing on dozens of sharp iron spikes that rose several inches upward. He hung there, dangling over what he knew would range from severe impalement to certain death if he lost his grip. When he glanced down, he could see many, many bones from victims of this well-crafted trick. There were not just bones of elves, dwarfs, men and other such adventurers, but there were bones of orcs, gnolls, and even trolls. Trolls? Thistlethorn asked of himself. He knew that such creatures would be wounded by landing on iron spikes, but that they would regenerate in time. Such creatures would be able to get out. He looked closer for an answer as to why troll bones would be mingled in with the others. Finally he saw a copper-tinted, tarry, bulky substance that coated the iron spikes. Troll bane. While he spoke, he pulled himself up with the help of Brox. Thistlethorn had been so shook up by the experience that he had to go sit down in the passageway. The idea of having his bones mixed in with those of foul monsters proved very unnerving. It was a full 10 minutes before he spoke. "I don't know how we are going to get around that room. Climbing down into that spike-filled floor and crossing it could be fatal. Especially if we get stabbed by one of those spikes and get lockjaw." Brox poured the shortling half a flagon of berry budge. "Don't worry about that approach," said Brox, handing the flagon to Thistlethorn. "I saw a ledge running around the side. It's only a span wide, but the advantage of our being small is that a span wide is wide enough." Indeed, there existed a narrow ledge that ran around the edge. For a too tall or a stocky dwarf, walking around the edge would have been nearly impossible. A slender nimble elf may have had trouble but probably would have been able to pull it off. The gnome and shortling made a slow shuffle all the way around. Within a quarter of an hour, they exited the far door. Not everything in the Crossdown world was designed to cause harm or be distasteful. The former splendor of this underground realm could often be seen from time to time. After exiting the room without a floor, they found themselves in a low chamber that had something extremely common but rarely found in a dungeon: a window. The window was long and narrow and overlooked one of the Crossdown world's courtyards, places that had originally been built for their stunning serene landscape. Landscapes of such splendor were difficult to produce in a dungeon. This, however, was a masterpiece. The entire courtyard took up the area of a colossal colosseum in length, width, and height. The ceiling had been magically enchanted to give off the glow of twilight, with one side being reasonably bright, and the other fading almost completely into night's darkness. The two men saw winding, crisscrossing paths of cobblestone that wove around stone park benches and a gazebo. Strange varieties of vegetation that only grew underground were scattered about, forming round bushes, droopy trees, and even a complex series of tall hedges that made up a maze for individuals to idly navigate. Brox pointed to a place for a pond, currently dried up. Standing next to the pond, there appeared a water fountain in the shape of a great stone serpent, all coiled up and ready to strike. Between its fangs, Brox could see a hole where water could spray out of its maw. He wanted to see water spray out of the maw and refill the pond. Due to his situation of dealing with the Shaden Morgue, he did not have time to climb down into the courtyard to turn on the water. The gnome began to wonder how this area had not been spoiled like the majority of the Crossdown world when he felt Thistlethorn tap him on the shoulder. The gnome turned and started to speak when he saw Thistlethorn hold up a warning hand to maintain silence. The shortling pointed to the far side of the courtyard. Brock saw a huge arch that led down a corridor, disappearing into the darkness. A few dozen paces away from the arch, toward the center of the courtyard, were two torcheries of red burning coals that gave off a sharp yellow flame. From this light, Brox could see several vague forms carefully making their way down the corridor toward the arch. After a moment, Brox could tell that the vague forms were a generous number of goblins, maybe a score, and 3 hobgoblins, the big cousins of the former monsters. The gnome's initial thoughts were we have been spotted and we should run. He wished to put as much distance between themselves and the creatures of chaos as possible. Then he noticed something very unusual about the green-skinned monsters. They were not brandishing weapons. In fact, he could not see any weapons on any of the goblins. They had no swords or axes in their hands, no short bows or spears strapped to their backs, and not even a dagger tucked away into their belt. Moreover, the hobgoblins, which normally carried hefty hammers or spiked morning stars in one hand and thick wooden shields in the other, were not so armed. They only appeared to possess big sticks, not clubs, just sticks. "What are they doing?" asked Brox as he watched them all stop just shy of the entrance into the courtyard. Thistlethorn shook his head. "I don't know. This is very strange. Who has ever heard of goblins and hobgoblins that weren't armed tooth and nail?" The biggest hobgoblin said something to one of the goblins. Neither Brox nor Thistlethorn could understand what the hobgoblin had said, since there was a large distance between them and the monsters. Moreover, the hobgoblin spoke with a deep, guttural voice, which was very hard to understand. The tone of the voice, however, rang out very clear. The hobgoblin had given the goblin a command to do something dangerous. The goblin seemed to be rather distraught over the command. In fact, the monster took a step back and pointed at one of the torcheries, gibbering on about something. Brox caught the word death couched between the words fire and fly. Since goblins spoke in a tangle of phrases, it proved too difficult to understand what he meant. Nevertheless, the hobgoblin responded to the other by clobbering him with the big stick that he carried. In short, the goblin walked from the back of the group to the front, just one step shy of entering the courtyard. Brox and Thistlethorn could see that the goblin was dressed in the tattered remains of a piecemealed set of cured hide armor coupled with a rusty chain mail vest. The goblin hesitated, not wanting to take another step. The hobgoblin that had been barking out commands gave the goblin a hard shove, thrusting the goblin into the courtyard. Immediately, the goblin's eyes showed extreme fear, a fear that was so strong that even Brox and Thistlethorn felt uncomfortable. The goblin looked at the 2 torcheries and a tree known as a sour seed tree, aptly named due to the fact that the seeds were incredibly sour. The seeds of this tree were highly prized by foul creatures such as bugbears, gnolls, orcs, hobgoblins, and goblins. Ironically, trolls were known for both having a bitter hatred of sour seeds and for attacking anyone in possession of them. It was obvious to the 2 little men that the goblin desired the seeds found growing on the sour seed tree, but it was not obvious to the 2 of them as to why it was afraid of the torcheries. The goblin moved slowly at first, sliding its feet before he broke out into a full run toward the sour seed tree. All the while, it kept its eyes upon the flames of the torcheries. Whoosha! From the torture on the right, a ball of fire spun off the top of the yellow flame, rushing toward the goblin as he scrambled away and dove behind a stone bench. The fireball slammed into the stone bench and exploded with a roaring sound. The explosive noise of the fireball boomed with reverberations, echoing from one end of the courtyard to the other, bouncing off the stone walls with a roaring, crashing sound. The flames from the fireball spread across the stone bench, dissipating harmlessly. Part of the goblin's armor blistered from the heat, but outside of that, the monster appeared unharmed. Immediately, after this spectacle, the rest of the goblins and hobgoblins went running into the courtyard with a yell as loud as the fireball's explosion. The din caught both of the little men off guard, scaring them and causing them to step back defensively. The monsters broke up into 3 groups with 6 or 7 goblins in each group and 1 hobgoblin, 2. Each of these groups ran toward a sour seed tree, attempting to collect the sour seeds growing on the tree. Thistlethorn saw 1 goblin in each group that carried a wicker basket, of very poor quality, into which the sour seeds could be placed. The job of the hobgoblins was to smack sour seeds off the tree branches with the big sticks that they carried. The goblins would scramble around and pick up the sour seeds as they fell in clumps and throw them into the basket. Although their style was random and disorganized, they kept colliding with one another. They moved with furious speed, knocking seeds down and tossing them into the basket. Their need to move with such speed became exceedingly understandable. The torturies began to flame up brightly and shoot off more fireballs. Most of the time the monsters would scatter, so when a fireball exploded, it would only get one in its fiery sphere. The first fireball caught a goblin, and the monster disappeared into smoke and ash instantly. The fireball's destruction was so complete that it burned all the way through the goblin, down to the creature's bones, causing a full 5th-degree burn. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, left of the goblin, save the ashes and rising smoke. The hobgoblins seemed to have better intelligence, or luck, in avoiding the sure destruction of the fireballs. After a few moments, half of the goblins had perished. Brox noted that the goblin with the chain mail vest was nimble enough to dodge a second fireball. Brox was impressed. A fireball went racing toward a hobgoblin, who turned to run away. Unfortunately for him, a goblin, who was tossing sour seeds into the basket, was in the way. The hobgoblin tripped over the goblin, fell down, and pinned the goblin in the process. Both of them and the basket of sour seeds disappeared in the bright flash of the exploding fireball. There had been 3 other goblins that had been tossing sour seeds into the basket when it got annihilated. When these goblins saw the basket disappear and all of their hard work gone with it, they stood dumbfounded, unsure of what they should do. There followed another bright flash, and all 3 of them were obliterated. One of the hobgoblins barked out an order, and the 4 remaining goblins, which included the one with the chain mail vest, and the other hobgoblin, all responded by running as fast as they could. They proved to be not fast enough. 3 fireballs. And 3 goblins gone. One of the hobgoblins made it to the arch and stopped. Just half a step inside of the corridor. The hobgoblin that had stepped under the arch and into the corridor knew that he was safe from the destructive power of the torture fireballs. Therefore, he came to a complete stop. The other hobgoblin continued to run away from a flying fireball, trying to reach the safety of the corridor. The mage who had designed the torturies and had crafted a magical energy for the fireballs had placed a restriction upon the fireballs that they do not travel down any passage leading out of the courtyard. Specifically, none of the fiery incineration would exit the courtyard and rush into the corridor. Even though there existed only one step between the hobgoblins, when the fireball exploded, the first hobgoblin remained completely untouched, and the second one turned into smoke and ashes. Brox and Thistlethorn watched the hobgoblin simply disappear. Before the brilliance of the explosion could fully fade away, the only remaining goblin, the one with the chain mail vest, went racing out of the courtyard with a basket of sour seeds. The goblin stopped next to the hobgoblin, holding up the basket in triumph. Then it was all over. Silence. No shouting. No explosions. No reverberations. No echoes. Only silence. The complete silence reminded Brox of the time when he was a little boy and he found himself locked in a closet that held the family's overcoats. All noise in the closet had been muffled, leaving only a feeling of empty terror. The courtyard had its own empty terror. The hobgoblin and goblin turned around and peered over the terrain of trees, bushes, plants, stone benches, the fountain, and the miscellaneous statues. They looked for others of their ilk but only found ashes. The smoke had already dissipated. In response to the demise of the others, the hobgoblin began to let out a roar of laughter, mocking their misfortune. The goblin just looked at the hobgoblin. The hobgoblin turned and started back down the corridor. The goblin glanced in the direction of the 2 little men, peered for a moment, nodded, and followed the hobgoblin down the dark corridor. When the sound of their boots scraping on the floor could no longer be heard, Brox and Thistlethorn continued on their own way.